Okay, let's get started. This is a 401 webinar. Welcome. So in the 401 webinar, what we cover is data sources and setting up your data sources, particularly your web analytics data sources, or sorry, your web accessible data sources that have REST APIs. We'll also look at dynamic data sources, which is a specific concept in our system that you may have taken advantage of or not so far. And then we'll look at working with data sources that are coming in the format of XML or JSON. So a lot of the data services that you might connect to will be returning data maybe as CSV or Excel, which is the tabular formats, but a lot of the other ones will use XML or JSON, and we'll do a section on that as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the data sources and connecting to your data in our system, which is a pretty key concept and kind of the first thing you're going to look at when you start building your own visualization separate from the pre-built gallery content. We do have quite a lot of resources in our knowledge base as well as videos online that you have access to look at and help you when you're building these. I'm just going to point out a couple of them. We have a general guide to REST API data sources that talks a little bit about how you look at API queries and the query syntax. There's also a link to just a 5-minute video that goes through the basics of working with APIs, and if you can spare the 5 minutes, it's really a good introduction to them if you're struggling or have some general questions about APIs. So you can get to that. And this is all accessible through our knowledge base, and that's you can just go to support.klipfolio.com to get access to all of our knowledge content, and you can do searches and different things there to get access to it. Another really useful document we have is, well, we have this high-level one that just talks about some of the services that we integrate in, and then links to any other documentation we may have on that specific service. So for any service that we connect to, when we do have documents, we'll have a short document that tells you the basics about connecting to that service and also links to that service's API. Regardless of what service you're looking at, you're going to want to go to their API docs to really understand about the endpoints and the content of the data you can get. For other data sources, we may know we connect to it, but we don't have specific documentation on it, so you'll find them listed here as well. This is not an exhaustive list. If you have another data source that you're trying to connect to, a data service, and you don't see it in that list, by all means look at the API documents they have, that service has, and then just give it a try through our connector gallery. And the last one, which we'll talk a little bit more on as we go through this section, is the date parameters document. So when you're setting up data sources, one thing you want to make sure you do, or typically you want to do, is use relative date ranges. So you might want to have, say, a 30-day rolling window in your data service. So in that case, you're going to want to not have to every day go in and adjust the start and end dates to be the most recent 30-day window. So don't hard code those dates. Instead, you'll use our relative date ranges, or sometimes the API service you're connecting to will have relative date ranges that you can use. So we'll talk a bit more about those when we get into the examples, but this document is a really good reference document that you're going to want to take advantage of when you're wanting to set up those relative date ranges depending on the types of date ranges that you set up. And it steps you through the basic syntax of how you do it and the order that you do it as well. So those are 3 resources online. Now let's actually get into the connector gallery. So when you're connecting to a data source, you're going to go to the library, and you're going to go to the data source section. And here's where you create a new data source. When you do that, you get to what's called our connector gallery. And here what we're trying to do, and we're continuing adding content here for services that we connect to, giving you a section that you can go to that has some pre-built queries that you can take advantage of. If you don't see the service that you're connecting to here, you can just go to the REST URL and put the queries in there exactly the same way. Additionally, of course, you can still connect to a database service if you have it, an FTP server, send in email attachments, and of course upload files to the system. Should that be the method that you want to get your data service in. Uploaded files are typically for data sources that don't change very often. For example, if you've ever worked with our map component, we often upload the region ID files that we have there because they're fairly static and don't typically change as they're tied to the map. You can search for a particular service. So I'm going to go to Google Analytics now. I'll just do Google. So it will bring up all the ones that have sort of related content to that. So I want to look at the analytics. When you click on a service, there'll always be the option to build your own, but then there'll be a set of pre-built queries that you might want to take advantage of. So if we look at a pre-built like audience metrics, you'll do whatever you need to do for that particular service. In the case of Google Analytics, we need to authenticate, and I already have a pre-built token, and then I'll go to the next step. And then I have access to a query that I can use. In this case, this was the audience metrics one I was going to do. So it happens to get from Google Analytics, which is a web analytics tool, users, sessions, page views. In these queries, anything you see that has these angled brackets or the less than and greater than signs needs to be replaced with an actual valid value for the query. So this profile ID needs to be a profile ID from my Google Analytics account. So I'm just going to replace that. Okay, let's see. And then I can do the get data. So in any of those queries, you just need to look at, okay, I'm sort of there. Look at anywhere where there's those angled brackets, and from there, make sure you enter in the data, the appropriate data. Going back to Google Analytics, again, if this create a custom one, wherever we have this, again, there'll be any pre-information you need to give to connect to the service. And then it'll have some basic query in it. And still the angle brackets you'll need to replace with whatever values you want to replace. So that's how it works. It's really to give you a start with working with the API. Those set of queries that we see, again, I'll cancel and come back into that area. It's not an exhaustive list of services you can get from the API. This is just some of the things you can get from the API. To really see everything you can get from, say, Google Analytics or Adobe or Facebook or any of the other services you might want to connect, you need to go to their API docs and see what they're providing through their API. But you can certainly use this as a start for those endpoints to help you get going that way. One of the things about when you're connecting to a service, it's always good to just try a basic query first to make sure that you can connect to the service, and then you can work on getting the right type of data there. But another thing that's really useful that a lot of services provide, I'll just go here again, is often they provide what's called a query explorer. So here there's the Google Analytics Query Explorer in this case, and I'm just going to pop over that to show you an example of that. So anytime we're talking about a query explorer, we're talking about something that's provided by the service itself, not by Klipfolio. So it's something that you can use to explore their API. So in this case, it's Google Analytics I'm looking at. When I go into there, I authenticate. And again, now for my Google Analytics account, I'm looking at Klipfolio data. And I have several different views that I can change to and see different data. And pull the data for that. So I'll go back here to the support view. In the Explorer, it lets me pick time ranges. I can use a date picker or the Google Analytics date ranges, which are so many days ago, and then today and yesterday are also supported. So by default, it populates it with just a 30 days ago and to yesterday. And then I can pick the metrics that I want to collect data for and the dimensions. So once I'm happy with the query, and there's other things I can do here, I can do a run query. Again, this is just the Google Analytics Query Explorer. The different query explorers will be slightly different depending on the service that's providing them. But this is how I test my query. So now I look and I see, okay, so I had dimension by date. So I've got my dates and I asked for new users and sessions, and that's what I got. So once you're happy with that, if you're working with a Query Explorer, then what that Query Explorer will do will provide you the URL that you need to actually execute that query in Klipfolio. So here you can see API query URI. So if I just copy that, then I can go back to Klipfolio and I can paste it in here. And it's already put in the GA profile that I was working with and the time ranges that I was working with, and then I can get data. And then I can see that it works in Klipfolio as well. So the Query Explorers are just really useful for just testing those queries, making sure that they're working correctly, that you're getting the right data, and then just giving you that URL so you don't have to figure out exactly, is it called sessions? How do I refer to dimensions? Do I need a GA colon? What do I need in the query? So always take advantage of those if the service you're connecting to does have the API. It does have a Query Explorer, because it is really helpful to look at that. So then moving on a little bit to the relative date ranges, let's just talk about that a little bit. So here I copied that query from the Query Explorer, and I'm just going to go back to the Query Explorer, and you can see I have those things. I'm just going to change this a little bit just so we can see some other options that we could do here. So in the Query Explorer, I might be just doing something like 14th to the 27th, say. And I'm going to run the query. And then what I'm getting is actually these hard-coded dates, and I'll copy this one over as well. I'm going to replace my query, and I'm going to get data. So now I'm getting data from the 14th of September as we set up to the 27th of September. But again, these are hard-coded dates. So I want to use relative date ranges. So we've seen with Google Analytics, I can specify so many days ago, but maybe I want to do month to date, so from the start of the month. So the way Klipfolio relative date expressions work is you always have what I call a curly or squiggly bracket, and then the keyword date, and then you describe what kind of date do you want. And again, that's described in the date parameters document that we highlighted earlier in this webinar. So here I would like to look at start of month. So that's start of month, and then format. And I'll talk about format in a second. And then for this one, I want to go to date dot. Okay, so now you can see the query is going from September 1st to September 28th. And as the calendar moves forward, it's going to continue to go up to today. And then when October 1st happens, this data source is going to change to show data from October 1st to whatever the current date is. So it's automatically going to roll over and always be showing you your months to date data. So the syntax for this is always in the curly brackets and with the keyword date, and then you use the various parameters that are described in this document. So a couple of notes about that. When we're doing a query, all the APIs expect their dates to come in a certain format and associated with certain parameters. So with Google Analytics, in this specific example we're looking at, Google Analytics expects a parameter called start date, start dash date, and end dash date. And it expects its dates to come in a format that looks like 4 years, a dash, 2 months, a dash, and 2 more months. So 2016-09-01 for the start of the month, for example. You might be working with a data service that expects their dates in another format. That's where this format parameter comes in. So if your service is expecting your dates in another format, for example, Google AdWords expects them as 4 years, 2 M's, 2 months, 2 day digits with no dashes between them, you can use this format parameter to specify that. So in that way, you can use your date parameters really with any data service that you want to connect to, just by using the format and then the syntax that you want to connect. Again, these things like the start date and the end date, that is API specific. So if you're working with something like Facebook, the words that they use are since and until for their end date. So you have to look at the API documents or the sample queries in the connector gallery to have a sense of what those are. But then once you know what those are, then you can apply the date parameters that you wish for that. Just one other note on that. I'm going to cancel out of here. Because these date parameters, sometimes people find them a little bit hard to understand, there is a little way that you can debug to see if you're getting the right date parameters in there. So at the bottom of this document, there's a little tip about date parameter, data expression validation. So you can use this little test URL. I'm just going to copy it. And I'm going to go back to our connector gallery. And I'm just going to go to a basic REST URL. Sorry. Let me see if I can change that. I don't actually want a Google Analytics one, so I'm just going to see if I can get back to just a basic REST URL. There we go. So just a basic REST URL lets you put in your query dates. So here, if I want to test a date parameter, like I want to see, okay, if I do date.start of month, what date do I actually get? .format. I can just type it in here as a test. And I change this to JSON. And I do get parameters. And all this does is echo back any parameters we put in there. So I see, oh, I'm getting 2016-09-01, which is what I want in this case. And if I said, oh, what I really want is start of the year, so then I can try this and see, does this work? Oh, no, there's something wrong there. So what's wrong? Okay, I typed the ob wrong. So again, I can do get and start there, and now I can see that I'm getting the right date. So it's a really nice little shortcut if you're working with kind of complicated data expressions and you want to know if your data expression is evaluating correctly. Then once you have it evaluating correctly, you can just copy that portion in to your start or end date in your query as needed. So that's kind of just touching on a few key concepts with connecting to APIs. If there's any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to dynamic data sources. Dynamic data sources are a concept in our system that's quite a powerful concept and quite a useful concept for certain use cases. So on the left-hand side, I have just a simple clip that's showing data for the last 30 days as the blue line, and for the previous 30 days as the green line. And this is for a specific, again, looking at Google Analytics, a specific Google Analytics profile. So as we saw when we were looking at the Query Explorer, I actually have a whole bunch of different profiles. So I have like my support one and my application one and a whole bunch of different ones. So I might want to show data for all of those, have a way to show them for all of those different profiles. So for each one of those profiles, then I would need to set up a data source. So let's just take a quick look at this clip just to see how what that data source looks like. It's a very simple data source. It's just the date and the user. But if I reconfigure this data source, the thing that's static in here is the profile ID. So if I want to look at a different profile ID, I would have to create another copy of this, duplicate this data source and create another version with that other profile ID. And maybe I have 10 profile IDs or 20 profile IDs. So another way to do that is to take advantage of our dynamic data sources, which allow you just to create one data source, but have that profile ID or any property in the data source be dynamic and set by some kind of variable using a user input control component or a user property in our system. So the example over here is taking advantage of that. So in this case, I'm using a drop-down list, a user input control, and I have two different profiles. And you can see when I select different ones that the graph changes to show data from those different profiles. So we're going to take a look at how you do that. So when you're going to set up a dynamic data source, the first thing you need to do is create that dynamic property that that data source is going to be built off of. So in this case, I'm going to edit this clip and take a look at that. So here what I've done is I've created a variable called GA profile, so GA uppercase P, and I need to give that variable a valid value. So we'll take a look at that. So when I look at GA profile, I've given it a valid value in the editor. When you first create the first instance of a dynamic data source, you need to do that get data to get that first instance. So this value, it's going to use this value, and it has to be a valid value so it can get data for the first instance of the dynamic data source. So once I have that variable created and I've given it a value in the editor, I don't have to have saved the clip or anything like that, just the variable and the editor, then I can go and create the data source. So we'll take a look at that data source. So the only difference when creating a dynamic data source is instead of hard coding the value that you want, so I want to make my profile dynamic, I put in that property that I want to use as a dynamic value. And the way you do it is kind of similar to what we looked at for dates. You use the squiggly bracket or the curly brackets, but instead of the date keyword, you use the keyword props, P-R-O-P-S. And again, we have documentation on knowledge base on this. The example in the knowledge base actually goes through setting up a Google Analytics dynamic data source, just as we're using here. But dynamic data sources can be used with any web accessible resource. Any one of their properties can be made to be dynamic. Can also be used with SQL data sources. One restriction to note is it cannot be used with Salesforce data sources. And it can't be used with data sources like Google Drive, FTP servers, ones that are file-based, that are pulling an entire file in. But any one of these that are query-based, it can be used with. So again, so what you do is you put in where you want to have that dynamic property, you use the curly brackets, the keyword props, and then whatever that dynamic property is. In this case, I happen to have called it GA profile. So when I get data, it gets that first instance of data based on that profile, based on the clip editor value, and then I can save it. And now I have a dynamic data source. Now I can take advantage of it. When you use it, it's just like any other data source. So a dynamic data source, so now I don't have to create a whole bunch of different data sources for this because I can just use this one instance, and as I change that property in my user input control, new instances will be created. So let's take a look at that. So in my clip, I'll cancel out of this one. In my clip, I have a drop-down list. It's using that variable GA profile. I'm going to associate a couple of values with it. So these are just two profile IDs in my system, and I just gave them some labels for this test purposes. The actual clip that's using this data source just selects the data like it would in any other clip. So I'm just selecting column B in this data source, and I'm just getting the last 30 values for the last 30 days. And the previous just goes back -60 to -30. So it's a very simple clip. So on the dashboard, when we look at it, when I'm switching between these two different profiles, what's happening behind the scenes is that GA profile is getting a different ID, and the system is saying, okay, I need the instance of data for this ID. So it's creating a different instance of data for that particular ID, and then showing data for that ID. So if we go and look at this data source, I have a couple of hints that it's dynamic. I don't have a download button, and I don't have a refresh now button. But what you can do with dynamic data sources is you can go up to the URL, and where it says view, replace that with debug_info. So that's where the word view is. You replace with debug_info. And when you hit enter there, you get all the information about the data source. So you see the query string that was used. You see information about all the possible variables in your system. As this is a test account, you can see that I have quite a few. And then you actually see, the important part is down here at the bottom, where you see the different instances for each one that have been created for that data source. And the thing to notice about this instance, what you're always checking is the GA profile value. So I have an instance that's created for this profile ID, and I have an instance that's created for this profile ID. And I have another instance that's created. When you first create an instance, it creates it with all the different props, but you still just look for the GA profile ID. So that one's a bit hard to understand. I'm just going to use the X to delete that one. And that's one of the options. So with your instances, you can delete them. You can refresh them. So this is the refresh now button, but it's on a per instance basis. And you can look at the data for them. So if I look at the data for this instance, it's the data we've been seeing. But if I go back to Debug Info, and again, that's debug_info, replacing the word view, I can look at that data for that other instance. And I can see that that data looks much different. So in that way, you can see the data. You can check out the data for your specific instances if you're wondering if that data is getting correctly retrieved. You can refresh a specific instance if you want to get it up to date, because this dynamic data sources work like any other data source, so it's set up to refresh every 4 hours. So each one of those instances is going to queue every 4 hours. I may want to twig one to refresh right now so I can do some testing or make sure the data is correct. And you can delete instances. When you're working with dynamic data sources, never be afraid to delete instances, because I can delete those instances, but immediately when I go back to the UI, if I select that value again, the system's automatically going to recreate that instance. If that was an invalid instance, then I'll never select it again and it won't recreate it. But anytime I do select that instance, that value, that will trigger the recreation. So you can always delete the instances if you need to clean up your system a little bit, just like I did with that one instance that was in there. So a few things to note about dynamic data sources. You cannot reconfigure a static data source to be a dynamic data source. So if you have something that you want to use dynamic data sources for, you have to start with a brand new data source, make it dynamic right at the creation time. Likewise, the duplicate button. If you have a static data source and you do duplicate, and then you reconfigure to be a dynamic data source, it's not going to work. You need to start with a dynamic data source. Let's talk a little bit about debugging with dynamic data sources as well, and some of the other things that you need to be aware of. And again, if you have any questions along the way, just let me know. So if I go back into, I think I'm in the editor here, if I go back into this editor and have a look at that, say I wanted to add another value into here. So I'll do that. So this is another profile that we have, and I'll call it Web Profile 3. And then say I want to add another one, but I make a mistake. I add like an invalid instance. I have some kind of typo in my thing. So I'm going to add that one in just so you can see what will happen. Okay. All right. So let's save this and let's look at this. So here we go to this profile, and now let's go to profile 3. Let's see if I did a valid one. Now notice it takes a bit more time because it has to create that instance, because that instance didn't exist yet. And now let's go to the bad profile. Not so good. So let's go look here and see what's happening with Debug Info. So when you're first creating a dashboard with dynamic data sources, sometimes you do get bad instances because you have a typo or something you're still trying to figure out. So now we can see we got the good instance created here, and we can see when it was last refreshed, and we can look at the data if we want. The bad instance, a clue that you have a bad instance is you won't have a last refresh time because it didn't refresh successfully. I can look at the data and I'll see that I got an error null because the system still tried to go and get data for that profile ID I provided, but of course that profile ID was not valid. So in that case, I want to go back to Debug Info, and this is where this is important when you're first developing your dashboard with your dynamic data sources. I want to delete that instance. But I can't just delete that instance and then not fix what's going on in my dashboard. I have to actually edit my clip and remove that. Otherwise, that instance is going to keep getting recreated. And it can cause behavior and performance problems for your users because it's going to keep trying to refresh every 4 hours. If it's still in the drop-down list, they might try to select it, and there'll be that blank clip. So it's important to tidy those up when they don't make sense. So I'm just going to get rid of that. And I'm going to get rid of this. Let's save it next time. And now we're back to just our 3 valid profiles. I'm just going to take a minute to look at a question here. Okay, so is it possible to replace a drop-down menu with a map component? For example, a global company with different property IDs for different countries. You have one standard dashboard. If you click on a specific country on the map component, it shows the data from that specific Google Analytics property. It's a really good question. How would this work? So yes, it is possible because a map component has a concept of hyperlinks. So with the map component, you can associate you can turn on hyperlinks. I'll just quickly show really high level what I'm talking about. So here you can enable region hyperlinks, okay? So then you get this link component. Here, what you would do is you would set up your link component to be a hyperlink to the dashboard that you want to show. And you would pass in the parameter that you would pass into that dashboard would be GA. If we use the same variable that I already have set up, it would be param GA profile equals, and then you would pass in the appropriate profile ID depending on the region that they're clicking on. So basically, this would be an array of the same length as your IDs, where each link has a different ID that it's passing in. So then when the user clicks on that region, you can either spawn a new dashboard, replace the one you're on. You have different options with hyperlinks to take advantage of that. I might have a quick example if we have time that I can pop back to just show you a little bit more how the hyperlinks work, but definitely possible and definitely a great use case. And if we don't get into it much more in detail, if you do have additional questions on that, you can email support@klipfolio.com and just tell them that question, and we can definitely help you through there and point you to the right documents as well. Okay, so just one other note I just want to point out on the dynamic data source front is we've been talking about dynamic data sources using just one property, which is a profile ID. You can have multiple properties with your dynamic data source. Maybe you're making your start and end date dynamic, or maybe you have, like with AdWords, a client ID and a campaign ID that's dynamic, for example. So when you're working with multiple properties that are dynamic in a data source, you're going to want to take advantage of our submit button. So if you're not familiar with that component, there is a button component. And the reason why you want to take advantage of this is every time you change a value in a drop-down list, that resets the variable, and then that triggers the system to go out and look for that instance of data. So if you have multiple different properties associated with the instance of data, you want to set them all and then trigger the system to go out and look for the correct instance. Thinking about the AdWords example where I have a client and a campaign, if I just change the client and don't have a submit button, it's going to go and try and create an instance for the new client with the old campaign, which won't be valid with that new client, and you'll get an invalid instance. So that's why it's important to use the submit button. When I use the submit button, I change this to, instead of being instantly on button press, I associate it with the button, but I leave this check to instantly react to variable updates because the variables themselves may have interactions between them. So you want them to change so that the user can make the right selection, and then the user do their complete selections and then hit the submit button. As I only have one property in this case, I don't really need to do that, but it's when you have more than one. So you can see right now I change, nothing's changing until I hit the submit button. So very important with dynamic data sources, if you have multiple properties, you want to set all those properties to the value that the user wants, and then generate the instance. When we're talking about hyperlinks, back to your map question, you can pass multiple parameters in a hyperlink. So you can also have dynamic data sources that have multiple properties using a hyperlink as well. Just another note on that as well, when we're talking about properties and different ways that you can pass them into dynamic data sources. So any property or variable in our system can be set with a user input control. That's what we've been showing here. So a drop-down list, a date picker, a text field. Any variable can also be set as a user property, so users can have GA profile could be associated with users, and then each user could have their own value. So a user signs in and their GA profile is set to their profile ID, and they just see data for that profile. We also have that at the company level. Also hyperlinks, which we've talked about, you can pass in parameters that way. And we have two functions in our system, map and set, which are lesser used, but you can use those to set variable values right inside a formula. And there's some specialized use cases for those. You'll see that in our community when we talk about how to handle data sources where you need to have multiple pages and things like that. So that's the dynamic data sources. Any additional questions on that? And I'll go on to some stuff about the XPath, and then if I can, I'll quickly come back and see if I can show you a bit more examples on the map. Okay, so when we talk about XPath, we're talking about data sources that are coming in XML and JSON, as I mentioned at the beginning. I have a simple, have an XML data source here, and then I have another JSON one that we'll talk about because there are a few differences between them. We do have quite an extensive document, again, in our knowledge base that talks about XPath and how to take advantage of it with these different data sources. So the first thing I'll show you is this one of the common scenarios with XML. So one of the common scenarios with XML and JSON is that there may be some fields that show up for every element in the data source and some fields that only show up for some of them. And when that happens, you get a misalignment of data. And you can see that here because you can see I don't have any spaces in this one. So it's just taking it happens to be headlines. Where down here you can see there's some spaces, and that's because we're aligning the headlines with the correct users. So I'm going to look in this clip and take a look at what's causing that. So this is what an XML data source looks like. JSON looks very similar as well. So it's with this tree structure, non-tabular structure. I'll go over to one of these columns. So in order to select data, it's very similar still, just like when you're working with Excel or CSV. You can just click on the field that you want. and it'll just select the data for that field. It's selecting all the data elements in that field. There's selection options over here that allow you to change that a bit. So say I only want to select this specific one. So instead of selecting, if you think about it in terms of Excel, instead of selecting all of column A, I just want to select A1. I can do this, select only this URL, and I can set selection. And you can see that reference to that data point changed. So I'm going to go back. Okay, so here it was referencing all of them. So it's going from connections to person to API standard profile request to URL. When I say select only this one, it changes it to say go to the first connection, the first person, the first profile ID, and the first URL to just get that one. If I want to look at all URL elements, I'll change it again. Set selection. So in this case, it changes it to just do a / and then all URL elements. And that does change it because in this data source, I have a URL under here and a URL under here. So it's going to get both of those, the API and the site standard one. So you have these options to help you a little bit with getting your selection the way you want it. But as I was saying, one of the common problems is the alignment of data. So in this case, I'm selecting the ID, so the person's ID, and I'll evaluate that. And I've got 728 items. And now I want to see the headline for that person, those people. So again, I'm connections person headline, and I evaluate that. And I only have 693, so not every person element has a headline. So the way I line that up is with XML is I use the lookup function. So there's a few different tricks with XML. Definitely XML and JSON, so any XPath that you're working with. So definitely if you're struggling with it, you have a data source, definitely email support@klipfolio.com or go into support@klipfolio.com and just create a ticket there. We have quite a lot of experience working with these, so we can probably help you figure out how to get your data and give you some tips and tricks for going forward. So don't hesitate to take advantage of support for that for sure. So here I'm selecting all my IDs. And I'm seeing that I have my 720 IDs. And then for my headlines, I'm using a lookup function. So I'm selecting all those IDs, so I'm going to get the 728 IDs. But the second part, I'm selecting only the IDs that have a following sibling called headline. So in this case, I'm getting 693 items. And then I get the corresponding headline, and the lookup does the lining up for me. So this syntax here with the following sibling headline, that's just one of the tricks you can use, or one of the XPath constructs you can use to access your data. Following sibling, preceding sibling, ancestor, descendant, there are terms like that that you can use. Following sibling means, so ID and headline, if I look at that. ID is here, and then headline comes after it, so it's a following sibling. Headline is a preceding sibling for picture URL. So in that, the order, when you're looking at XML, determines whether it's following or preceding. When you're working with a JSON data source, you have to think of alphabetical. So in that case, the headline would actually be a preceding sibling because H comes before I in the alphabet. So those are just a little bit different. There are some differences between XML and JSON. But overall, they have a lot of similarities as well. So that's one trick, the following sibling. And again, there is documentation on our knowledge base related to that. I'm just going to do a quick look at the JSON side. So just give me a second here. I have a different dashboard here. This is Facebook data. So with JSON, there's some other manipulation we've done. So we've created a few of our own XPath functions that you can use specifically with JSON data sources, not with XML, but with JSON, one of the other differences with JSON. So in this case, I want to see the countries, the country names. And the way Facebook sets up their data source is the name is actually the name of the element, not the value of the element. So if I just select the value, which is the data slash value slash value, I'll just evaluate that. I get the numbers, but I don't want the numbers. I actually want the names of these elements. So we have a function called kf names. So you can see it here, kf::names. So I can say, give me the names of these elements. So the same XPath to values, but now tell me what those names are. And in that way, I can get the names of the elements. So that's quite common with JSON data sources, or you may run into it with JSON data sources where you want to actually get the data that's contained in the element name rather than the element value, and you can take advantage of kf names. There's also kf fill elements and kf elements at. These functions are documented again in our knowledge base. And just one other one to touch base on. Sometimes people need to want to make their XPath somewhat dynamic, take advantage of a variable dropdown or something like that. So we often get that question. So in this case, if you look at this column, this third column, I'm looking at page engaged users. And when I change to page impressions, it changes to show me the impressions. But that XPath is different for each one of those. So the way I do that is with a function called the data source function. So let's just look at a couple of constructs here. So the first column, I'm looking at days 28. So I use the index in or the square brackets around it to look at the period value equals days 28 to get the values. And again, looking at my data source, I have page engaged users days 28, those ones, and then I have page impressions days 28. So here I want to get page engaged users days 28. So I just specify that. I can use and. There's a lot of syntax, and that's all based on the XPath syntax. Here, instead of doing that, so that's a page engaged users, I want to get the third item. So for page engaged users, I have 3 items. For page impressions, I have 3 items. And there I use another syntax, like this, to index into the third element, or the second element, or whatever I want. So you have quite a lot of flexibility with the XPath. The third one with the dropdown that we talked about uses the data source function. So I want my XPath to not have a hard-coded value for the metric name. I want it to use the metric variable. So you can't put variables directly into the XPath. Like I can't just put the $metric right in here. So I have to take advantage of the data source function. Data source function just does the same thing as that other column. So I'm specifying the data source ID here. So the only difference is I'm building up the XPath here with a concat function so that it looks the same, days 28, and in this case it's page impressions. But if I change this to page engaged users and evaluate that concat again, you can see now it says page engaged users. So that's a way to do a bit of like a dynamic change in your with your data source. There is lots of applications with this when working with XPath. So if you want to do that, you take a look at the data source function. And again, don't hesitate to email support because we can help you with those scenarios. So that's looking at the XPath in general. Any questions about that? Let me just see if I can quickly, in the last few minutes, pull up also just a little bit about hyperlinks and working with hyperlinks in our system. So I'm going to go back to the other account we were working in. Give me 1 second. I'm just having a look to see if I can find it. I don't have a good example. Just looking at some of our other training ones just to see if there's anything in there that we could use quickly. The documentation is available on our website. I'll just go to that briefly. So it tells you a little bit how to do the formatting, how you do the syntax with the tab, the labels. And then what your different options are. We talked about reuse or replace our options with your hyperlink. And then down here, it'll show you how you the syntax for the parameter. So you set up your hyperlink, and then question mark, and then it's param, colon, and then the variable and the value. Param, colon, the variable name, and the value that you want to set it up. So take a look at that document, because that's a useful document, but also if you have any questions, just drop us a line for support and we can help you with that scenario. Are there any other questions? Okay, great. So thanks everyone for attending the 401 workshop. I hope you found it a little bit useful. Any feedback, we're welcome to hear. Any other topics you would like to see covered in training, different topics, things that you would like more in depth, please feel free to drop us a line and let us know about that too, because we're definitely interested in learning that. Thanks a lot, everyone.